two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'll be speaking today with Pete Meyers, coordinator of the Tompkins County Workers Center, about the latest living wage news. Everybody's been complaining about inflation, but no one's been doing anything about it. No, the Alternatives Federal Credit Union decided not to wait 2 years to do their normally biennial living wage for Tompkins County study. They went ahead and did it this year, just 1 year after the last one. Pete Meyers, what did the credit union find?
So, well, in essence, the credit union found that between their study of early July last year, 2021, and I think it was like May or June, probably May of this year, that inflation for Tompkins County had gone up by 8.36%. So that's obviously, as long as I've been here in Ithaca, that's the highest inflation rate we've had. And, like our living wage figures that we use, especially for living wage employers, we're getting out of sync with what's actually going on the ground. And as you mentioned, it's been every 2 years that Alternatives updates the study. And we decided jointly, and they totally agreed, let's do this year because, we're getting a lot of complaints from workers that this living wage is not enough. The 1532 living wage was not enough. And so now we have a living wage of 1661. So it jumped from 1532 to 1661. And it's made up of different categories. For example, rent is one of the most important categories in a way because that tends to be the most expensive monthly expense. Food, transportation, healthcare, recreation, savings, miscellaneous expenses, and taxes. And there was pretty much inflation in everything.
There has always been a certain problem, I think, with the rent figure, because it's rent for Tompkins County, which is the metropolitan statistical area. So that's how the feds figure the what a fair rent,
the cost of housing,
fair market rents,
fair market rate.
Yeah,
right.
And but what we also know is that the city of Ithaca is way higher than that. And yet, for a lot of people, the city is the most desirable place to live because that's where, for instance, if you're working in a restaurant in the city, you may leave your job at a time, or a bar even more so, you may leave your job at a time when there are no buses. And it's best if you can just walk a few blocks home. So for all sorts of reasons, but set that aside. I mean, it is what it is.
Yeah, let me just say, I mean, it's it's an unusual situation with a county this size to have a living wage so high. And you're totally right. Somebody living in Groton would not be paid, that this is a grand average. The rent is actually this year is 1127 is the fair market rate for Tompkins County. And if we had Ithaca, it would certainly be considerably more. It's, the question becomes like how in the weeds are we going to get, if you will. This is a county that actually has an unusual amount of people that commute here. For various reasons, but Cornell would be one of the biggest ones. So, like at least 10,000 people that commute here every day from surrounding counties where the rent would tend to be much cheaper. However, they're paying transportation costs that in some ways cancel out that. the lower rent, if you will.
Yeah, in fact, that number, the Danter study, which was 7 years ago, calculated that 15,000 people commute into the county from out of the county.
Yeah, and I don't know how accurate that 10,000 person figure is.
I think it's low. It's probably low.
It could be, right.
Well, but that's again quibbling around the edges. Now, another thing that some people say is, and what if I have children? That's not in the study.
Right. So, there's actually that's never been in the study. That does raise. I was at a national conference for organizations that certify living wage employers. And the thought around that was that we might want to start thinking about that. I mean, the thing is, like, you can't pay somebody more money who has kids than somebody who doesn't have kids. It would certainly raise the living wage, but I mean, I think it's a conversation worth having, and it's actually happening on the national level as well.
Yeah. Well, you say you can't. That's in this country under the laws that we operate under, because I have a vivid memory of, but this is like decades ago, when I lived in New York, hosting a guy who was a friend of a cousin of mine. And he was talking about his job and what he was making. He was quite young at that point. We were all very young at that point, like just out of school or just out of college. And I said, and here he is traveling internationally a bit. And I said something about, yeah, but if that wouldn't be very good pay if you had a family. And he said, if I had a family, the company would pay me more. And that blew, yeah, you're showing the kind of mind-blowing concept that is to an American. And yet here is, at least way back, this must have been the 60s, a Brit, to whom it's a perfectly natural thing. A company pays more if you have a family. So I don't know, maybe companies in Britain felt pressured to do that sort of thing because they didn't have the option of offering health care, because everybody had it under the National Health Service.
Right. That's a big difference with our country, of course.
But you were saying something about having children, child care. What is it? That there is a concept. Well, go on.
Well, we're actually, I was just in a conference, a 4-day conference in North Carolina, in Durham, North Carolina, just 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, actually. And it was a combination of 8 local organizations that certified living wage employers. And to be clear with the viewers and the listeners, we were the very first organization in the entire country back in 2006 to have started living wage employer certification in the first place. So, like, obviously, these other groups, 7 other groups besides us, primarily from North Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, are local certifiers. But now we have a new national organization called Living Wage for Us. That was initially kind of seeded by the international organization Oxfam, and specifically Oxfam USA, a year ago, and we were close to that process. And we were all excited about this, about the idea of joining forces, because they actually do a family wage as well. They have different tiers of certification. Like tier 1, for example, is basically what our living wage is. It's for a single person. But then there's the presumption that many people have families, and actually some amount of single people that are single now will have families. That there would also be a family living wage. And, they're really, they don't want to rule out smaller employers that might not be able to afford the family living wage, but they, want to kind of like really open up that process. And they've actually got just in the last 6 months, have gotten some large employers to be a part of this, including Chobani Yogurt, Dannon Yogurt, and they're really working nationally. And there was talk there every of the organizations would have to agree to this, but actually joining forces together and kind of having a very similar certification where there would be a dual partnership. Let's say if the Tompkins County Workers Center were going to think to go to Cornell and get Cornell to be a living wage employer, they might be more attracted to actually doing that through a national organization if they felt they could do it. I mean, I actually believe Cornell could be a living wage employer. I mean, they could pay everybody a living wage. We know for a fact that they don't right now. And the reason for that is because there's enough temp workers that kind of stayed temp workers for quite a while. I have a lot of people coming to us about that, where they, that don't necessarily make a living wage.
Mm-hmm. And I think Cornell never quite got over the fact that way back, like 1981, the UAW organized a lot of their service and maintenance workers, and they're trying to dodge that and have been trying to dodge that ever since. Figure out ways to get people to work for them without letting them become union members.
And one of the ways to do that is to keep them temporary.
Yeah, is to pretend that they are temporary, even though they may in fact be permanent. Or
they've been doing, could have been doing a temp position for 10 years.
ongoing. So the big bear on the hill is a bit of a problem for this community when it comes to working conditions.
Right.
As I know from experience.
I bet you do.
I think you get your most loyal helpers from experiences at Cornell.
Probably. You being a prime example of that.
So, let's see. There's a little technical thing that I'd like to slide into. Namely, one hears about minimum wage and one hears about living wage, but there is definitely a difference, and maybe you could explain that.
I mean, the minimum wage is just, in some ways, an arbitrary figure that the government puts forth. So, for example, on the federal level, as some of your listeners will know, there's a lot of states in this country that still pay $7.25 is the minimum wage, which, obviously there are some states that are cheaper to live in New York, but no state is, nobody can live on $7.25 an hour. The living wage is basically, we've considered it recently at Workers Center as like the basic subsistence wage. That's what the living wage is, for a single person, to be clear. It's all about raising the bar for what people should be paid at work, and the living wage gives that option. It's actually easier to raise the living wage, such as we just did, and we've got 118 employers who will work to actually create that new living wage if they've not already been doing so. So it's the basic subsistence wage, and the Worker Center is looking to make this happen in other arenas as well, including a county campaign to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, and that's a huge campaign. But we actually have some biters in the county legislature at this point with that.
Well, that may be difficult in the Empire State.
And the reason for that is it's actually not enabled by statewide legislation. The last time it was brought in the state of New York was New York City back in 1962, attempted to change that to create their own minimum wage, and the state said no. However, I would say that we're in much different terrain right now than we were, 60 years ago. Because New York is presently right now, New York City is at $15 an hour, the minimum wage, as well as Long Island and Westchester counties. Upstate New York is $13.20, with the hopes it's going to go to $14 come early January of this coming year. Yeah. It's all dependent on the state's budget director to make that decision.
Yeah. But this differential minimum wage between the city and some other areas and the rest of the state was actually set by the state legislature, I think.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. That's correct.
It's not something where the city went out on a limb and
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, part of our inspiration comes from like Seattle, Washington. I think it was like 5 years ago, passed legislation to bring the wages up to 15, and it was phased in over 3 or 4 years. And that's enabled in the state of Washington, they could do that without state approval. The same with California. There's some cities in California that have raised their minimum wage to a living wage as well, or 15, if you will. Because there's an argument, the fight for 15 movement was really about $15 is a living wage, but that's actually not the case now.
Yeah, well, we had an odd long period recently when there was hardly any inflation, but a few of us are old enough remember when inflation was a pretty normal thing. And you set a price or you set a wage and you just had to keep changing it. And I think we're back into that kind of a period now. Why not?
Right. The question becomes like, how quickly do you change it? For example, like the Worker Center has always historically given our living wage employers a year to catch up. An employer has to pivot, especially nonprofits. Many organizations and businesses have budgets for the year. And if we said you've got to change your wage to this new wage, which we just updated to 1661, you got to do that on a dime, would not be realistic. So we do still give people a year to catch up.
Sure. And we hope that people have, if nothing else, a little say. Well, and that is one good thing about the living wage as specified by the Alternatives Federal Credit Union. One of the things that they figure on is that everybody should be doing a little saving. In other words, you shouldn't have to spend absolutely everything as soon as you get it.
Right.
You can set it aside for savings. And so hopefully if you've been working at a living wage and you've set aside some savings, you can get your car repaired in an emergency. You can handle a dental emergency, and you have something if prices just scoot ahead of everything else, as they have been tending to do recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually something to think about because it's never been factored into the living wage study as conducted by AFCU. We live in a college town, suffice to say, and we've got a lot of people here who have major student loans to pay. And so right now, the living wage for savings, if you just isolate out savings, is $76.42 a month. And, for students, people that graduated school, the student loans are probably going to be definitely north of $76.42 a month.
Yeah, and that's not even a factor that they take into account, because my memory of the history is that it had to do with their own. I mean, they did this first not as a public service, but for their own purposes. They, back in, I think it was 1995, their newest tellers were complaining that they couldn't live on what they were paid. And so the credit union started looking at, hey, but we're paying the going wage for the kind of job you're doing. And these would have been probably young people just out of high school or something like that, not having been to college to have a loan or anything like that. And so they started doing the calculation, they actually got an intern from I think Cornell ILR typically, or
Yeah,
some department at Cornell,
exactly.
and discovered that no, indeed, you can't live on this,
Right.
even if though that's what's the going wage. And so they raised their lowest wages.
Oh, right. And I will say, with all the programs going, the 8 local programs in the national program, we're actually the only one that actually has a local, well-respected community development credit union that actually is behind the figures. It's not like a larger national study like the MIT Living Wage Survey, which does every MSA in the country as well. There are other different studies out there. We're the only one that really has a local source that's looking at Tompkins County exclusively.
Okay, so I'm sure when getting back to the minimum wage business, I'm sure it helps minimum wage workers psychologically to know that they can't possibly live on what they're getting. Maybe that even inspires them to organize a union to try to get better pay. But that's not helping workers psychologically is not the only thing that the living wage enables the worker center to do. I mean, I think you've alluded a few times to your program of certifying living wage employers, and you might, I know you've sort of tossed off the number, but you might repeat it, how many there are and how it's
Oh,
done.
presently we have 118 certified living wage employers. Our largest one now is actually an industry. It comes from an industry that would not traditionally pay people living wage, and it's huge. The Racker Center, which serves people with developmental disabilities, just certified 3 months ago. And you know, the challenge for caregiving industries, whether it's care for people with developmental disabilities, senior care, child care, is the fact that a lot of their funding, most of their funding comes from state and federal sources. And these state and federal sources don't really, their reimbursement plan doesn't allow them to pay their workers a living wage. So the Racker Center, I was told by the executive director, Dan Brown, that they turned around $3 million in the last couple of years to make this happen. It was that much of a commitment. And also many caregiving industries, Racker was a prime example, we're actually having a hard time attracting workers, to want to work there if the wages were going to be below a living wage. And there's a way right now, and this is not a disrespect to our program, but the market, the market is really having a major impact in driving wages up too. So it's just like workers are not wanting to put up with sub living wage jobs these days. I mean, obviously there's still a lot of workers that are having to do that. But this is a workers' economy right now. It seems to me.
It is, and in fact, quite oddly, all sorts of jobs that used to look good suddenly can't be filled. I mean, there aren't enough bus drivers these
Right.
days.
Right.
And all sorts of nice plans go astray because nobody can be found to do the job.
Right. It's funny. Last year, must have been about 15 months ago, the Marriott Hotel down on the Commons in Ithaca decided to certify as living wage because they were having a really hard time finding workers, and they got a lot more people applying for jobs there after they decided to do that. So for them, it's certainly been a win, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think we've heard many times over from various living wage employers that it's not necessarily a sacrifice on their part. It may actually save the money because they don't have so much turnover and they don't have to spend as much time and effort training new people. When if you pay a lower wage, people come and start to work for you, and then they think they can do slightly better somewhere else and they're gone. And even if somebody has the skills, they don't know where the broom closet is. So there's always stuff that has to be trained when anybody is new, no matter how skilled and experienced they are.
Right, and people being paid less than a living wage does not inspire loyalty for them to the given business they work for.
Okay. So we should just say a little bit about the Workers' Center in our last our last minute or two. I think the biggest news for the public from the Workers' Center is that the Workers' Center just moved.
That's right. We moved to the third floor of the Clinton House. For those who don't know where the Clinton House is, it's in downtown Ithaca, just a block and a half off the Commons, and it's at the corner of West Seneca Street and North Cayuga Street. And our address, for those of you who want to know where we're at, we're not always there, is 103 West Seneca Street, and it's on the third floor. It's Suite 301B. Suite 301B. And you just walk in the entrance on Seneca Street. You can either take the stairs on the left up to the third floor, or you can take the elevator. I will say it's the first time we've had full access for those with disabilities that can't go upstairs or walk very far. So that makes a big difference.
Yes, that's a real improvement that there's an elevator.
Right.
And well, you were saying where the building is. It's the one with the white columns.
Yes, and 3 balconies, first, second, and third floor balcony, and the Worker Center is on the third floor, and we have the third floor balcony, and it's to die for. It's huge.
Some people may associate the building with New Route School. New Route
Yes.
School is in the front part that fronts on
Right.
No, on I guess it's North Cayuga Street, actually.
Right.
And our part is right around the corner, or the Workers' Center's part is right around the corner where there's a sort of glassed in enclosure to
Right.
go in and get the elevator. Thank you, Pete Meyers, for repeating the news about the new living wage for Tompkins County.
Of course.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.